In this road, there lay so many dead rebels that they formed a line which one might have walked upon, as far as I could see. They lay there, just as they had been killed, amid the blood which was soaking the earth.
The wound had filled every building and overflowed into the country round, into farmhouses, barns, corn cribs, cabins, wherever four walls and a roof were found together.
I had to wring the blood from the bottom of my clothing before I could step, for the weight about my feet. Clara Barton.
September 16th, 1862. McClellan turns back Lee and his Confederates at the battle at Antietam Creek in the bloodiest day of the war. On the Union side, more than 12,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing. The South lost fewer men, nearly 11,000, but that number represented a quarter of its army. Upon entering the war, both the Union in the North and the Confederates in the South hoped it would end quickly. But the battle at Antietam Creek was just one bloody day among hundreds in America's Civil War, a war in which more than 3 million Americans fought. A war in which more than 600,000 men, or 2% of the population, died. Nearly every Southern family lost a son, a brother, or a father. Americans displayed bravery and cruelty, ingenuity, and poor judgment. The war was long and horrible, and it changed forever the lives of all who lived through it. White and black soldiers, slaves, settlers in the West and Native Americans, professional women, and those who kept families together back home.
Future years will never know the seething hell in the black infernal background, the countless minor scenes and interiors of the Secession War, and it is best they should not. The real war will never get in the books. Walt Whitman.
The Civil War began on April 12, 1861, when the Confederate Army began bombing Union troops at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. General Pierre G.T. Beauregard demanded that Major Robert Anderson and his Union troops withdraw from Confederate territory. Men and women watched from their rooftops as the shells screamed over Sumter. The attack at Fort Sumter followed decades of American unrest over slavery, states' rights, social values, and Western expansion. It had gotten so bad that politicians were coming to Congress with revolvers and knives in their briefcases, unwilling to compromise. Southerners feared that Abraham Lincoln, the newly elected president, would end slavery. So they seceded from the Union, elected their own president, Jefferson Davis, and wrote a Confederate Constitution. By the time shots were fired in Charleston Harbor, the Confederacy had 7 states. America had become 2 countries, and Abraham Lincoln was going to put it back together again. Major Anderson and his troops withstood 1 day of intense cannon fire without injury. After 34 hours, Anderson surrendered Sumter. He returned north carrying a ragged flag. The victory cheered the South and set the North on fire. The shot-torn Sumter flag waved from the statue of George Washington in New York's Union Square. 100,000 New Yorkers surrounded it, demanding vengeance.
So impatient did I become for starting that I felt like 1,000 pins were pricking me in every part of my body, and started off a week in advance of my brothers. Frank P. Peake, Arkansas.
Lincoln immediately ordered states to send 75,000 men to serve as federal troops. Patriots rallied to the cause. His call put 4 more states into the Southern Confederacy, and Jefferson Davis arranged to move the Confederate capital from Alabama to Richmond, Virginia. At its beginning, the aims of the war were simple. The Confederacy would fight for independence, the North to reestablish the Union. But young men enlisted for many different reasons. Some for conscience, some for adventure, some for honor.
If a fellow wants to go with a girl now, he had better enlist. The girls sing, "I am bound to be a soldier's wife or die an old maid." Private Theodore Upson, 100th Indiana.
I tell the boys right to their face, I'm in the war for the freedom of the slave. When they talk about saving the Union, I tell them that is Dutch to me. I'm for helping the slaves if the Union goes to smash. Chancy Cook, Wisconsin.
Men streamed in with an assortment of gaudy and impractical uniforms. The first wave came as 90-day volunteers, another as 3-year volunteers. They elected their first leaders from among themselves. Most had no military experience. Amateurs led amateurs. When they arrived at camps, generals who had never led such large groups were expected to put together troops from these undisciplined civilians. Neither North nor South was ready for war. Both sides looked for leaders among career soldiers, many of whom had studied together at West Point and other institutions. They were classmates and friends. Robert E. Lee was first choice for leading the Union Army, but when his home state of Virginia seceded, he accepted Jefferson Davis's request to lead the armies of the Confederacy. Abraham Lincoln would struggle with lesser generals for 3 years until he found a match for Lee in Ulysses S. Grant. Northern officers like William Tecumseh Sherman warned their Confederate friends that they were bound to fail. The North had 18 million people. The South had only 9 million. 1/3 of those were slaves. 90% of the country's manufacturing took place in the North. 2/3 of the nation's rail lines and most of the iron, coal, copper, and precious metals were there. Northern trade with Europe was strong. It had cash for war supplies. But the South had its own advantages. Southern soldiers knew what they were fighting for, to protect their homeland. And they knew the country they had to defend. Northerners had to invade and conquer unknown ground.
Men fall. They're bleeding, torn and mangled. There's smoke, dust, wild talking, shouting, hissing, howling, explosions. It is a new, strange, unanticipated experience to the soldiers of both armies, far different from what they thought it would be. Charles Coffin.
After the attack at Fort Sumter, enthusiastic new soldiers waited impatiently to see action. It came for many at Bull Run, only 25 miles from Washington, D.C. Union troops headed for Richmond in summer heat. Confederate troops sent them running. When the battle was over, some 3,500 men lay dead or wounded. Another 1,300 were missing. The Union retreated. The South claimed a victory and boasted the battle had secured their independence. Lincoln quickly appointed General George B. McClellan to lead the Union Army, who organized, drilled, and equipped a formidable force of 250,000 men.
The soldiers must be fed and clothed. They must have guns, cartridge boxes, knapsacks, tents, and wagons. For the closing of the southern seaports, ships must be built. Never before was there such a commotion in the northern states. Charles Coffin.
During the Civil War, Americans in both the North and South applied their technological genius to the weapons of war. The Civil War witnessed the introduction of railroad artillery, military telegraph and railroads, landmines and telescopic sights, ironclad ships, and submarines. Lincoln found the new gadgets fascinating. He encouraged balloons for battlefield observations, tested new rifles, and encouraged inventors. McClellan's army became the best equipped in history. New developments in firearms design improved accuracy and range, enabling soldiers to pick off oncoming troops from a long distance. The Spencer repeating carbine, which could fire 7 shots in less than 30 seconds, issued devastating blankets of fire. Battlefield casualties were horrendous. Soon the rifle and the trench ruled Civil War battlefields. Lincoln may have entered the Civil War to preserve the Union, but no matter how he defined the North's objectives, this was a war about slavery.
The Civil War was about both Union and slavery. It was first about Union because the South had seceded from the Union and went its own way. And if you were going to restore the Union, you had to keep the Union uppermost in people's minds. Most Northerners would fight for Union. Because of racism, they were not willing yet to fight against slavery, although in time they came to hate slavery because slavery strengthened the Southerners. Driven by the need for freedom, the war was transformed into a war for Union with no slavery, a war to, in effect, have government of the people, by the people, and for the people, but now a people that would include all rather than just some.
Free blacks offering to fight were turned away from recruiting offices and told that this was a white man's war.
Free blacks contribute by constantly petitioning both Congress and the President for the right to serve as soldiers in the Army and for a clear statement from the President on what the fate of the slaves will be in the event of a Union victory. Frederick Douglass is very eloquent and very important in this movement. He besieges Lincoln. He's in Lincoln's office 3, 4, 5 times in those 3 years, demanding the right of black men to serve in the Army. And speaking in public, saying things like, there is no population in the country that loathes the slaveholders more than the slaves. Unleash the mighty power of black resentment.